One of the first steps in designing a disaster recovery plan is figuring out where you're going to recover once disaster strikes. If your data center or computing environment gets attacked by ransomware, swallowed up in a hurricane or a sinkhole, you better have an alternate site lined up to restore your operations. We're going to explore the details of the three main options most companies have for their disaster recovery site, including rolling your own setup, third-party DR services, and leveraging the public cloud. Each approach has its own pros, cons, risks, and costs. How do you keep a DR site in sync? What happens if a regional disaster takes down the recovery provider? Can the cloud scale to meet your DR needs? In this episode, we answer all of these questions and more. If this is your first time joining us, hi, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. I was a backup admin just like you for many years, and then I started helping other organizations design their backup and DR plans. Now I'm using this podcast to turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, and with me, I have the most flexible co-host in the podcast world. How's it going, Prasanna?
I'm good, Curtis. Yeah, we did have some logistics issues today or this week. So why don't you tell folks where you're at?
Yeah. So logistics being, I didn't realize I was going to be nowhere near where I normally record anything. Yeah. And so I happen to actually be at PodFest right now, which is a trade show designed specifically for podcasting. And I will say that that is why there's background noise that you're not used to hearing. So if this is a little noisy, I apologize for it. We'll do our best to trim that out. But I'm sitting here with a lavalier on, and I can see in my immediate view, there's 100 people around me as I try to record a podcast episode. And by the way, I want to do a big thanks to GoBox Studio. I'm going to take a picture of this setup that I have here. So this is a unit that you can buy to do podcasting literally absolutely anywhere. So that's what we're doing. We're doing.
You might need one next time when you start traveling.
Yeah. As I was walking around, I was like, hey, any chance I could use your cool setup? And he said, sure. And so I said I would mention the product. It's GoBox Studio. It's great. And then I called you and then I said, hey, do you want to record a podcast in 5 minutes? you said, okay. Well, that's what I'm saying. Thanks for your flexibility.
No, I'm glad you were able to find space and some gear,
Yeah, absolutely.
We're continuing in our Backup to Basics series. Today, We're talking about building a recovery site. We're, of course, continuing to work through our book, Modern Data Protection, and that you can get. Oh, there he goes. Each of us hold up our copy. And we're starting to talk about DR, right? We talked about, before we talked about, building, coming up with what's in a DR plan, what's not in a DR plan. We also talked about RTO and RPA, right? And RPO and RPA. And now, if you're going to do a disaster recovery, if you're going to recover from a disaster, what will you need, Prasanna?
You need some place to recover to.
Yeah, exactly. You need what we call a recovery site, right? The idea is that you must obviously, this should be obvious, but this is a backup to basics section. So when the disaster strikes, right, you've got a massive flood, you've got a fire, you've got an earthquake. I grew up in Florida. A sinkhole could take your entire data center. You cannot assume that your data center will be available for you when you go to do a disaster. Can you remember a little story from our friend that was in the Caribbean?
Yeah. He basically an island nation in the Caribbean that got hit by a hurricane and then lost power, lost internet connectivity back to the mainland, tons of damage. And they were trying to bring up their remote office that was on the island. And it couldn't connect back up to the mainland because that's where they had all of their Active Directory and other services. So nothing could come online, even though they had the people that they flew in from the mainland on site, but they couldn't become operational until they got a whole bunch of other things up and running.
Yeah, exactly. And they did what the first of what we're going to talk to 3 different options that you can do for a recovery site, which is to build your own, right? So they had, as I recall, they had 3 different physical locations on the island, right? And so they chose one as their recovery site. Does that sound about right?
Yep, that was right.
So the first option, there are 3 different options. The first option is to roll your own DR site, and I'm sure you've seen people do this quite a bit.
Yep, exactly. When I used to work at other storage vendors, well-known names, there were a lot of companies who would say, yes, I am going to have a production environment stood up in one data center, and I'm going to buy either the exact same configuration or something very similar and put it in another data center that I own or that I'm leasing in another location. Sometimes it is within the same campus, if you will, so it's close by. Sometimes it's further away, depending on what they are looking to recover from. Sometimes they might have multiple disaster recovery sites, depending on the type of location. Sometimes they might have multiple disaster recovery sites, depending on the type of disaster that occurs.
Right. If they're a multi state, multi county, multi, whatever they call it in other countries, then they could potentially use the other parts of the country as their recovery site, right? They use, like, so in our case, let's say we have California and Florida, right? And 2 states I picked just because I used to live there. Your recovery site for California could be in Florida and vice versa. Right?
That would be really bad in one scenario. Do you know what scenario that is?
Which one?
Having both sites on the coast.
Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, that you bring that up. I did work at a company that had their recovery sites. They built their own, and they had their recovery sites in 2 different places. They had one of them was in a data center in Dallas, and the other was in the basement of the World Trade Center building, right? And this is pre 9/11, and there was a freak snowstorm in Dallas that took out that data center, and this was the week of the bombing that happened in the World Trade Center. So basically, 2 things happened at the same time, 2 completely unrelated things. Sometimes the best laid plans. But that's what you can do, and you can have the more sites you have, you can basically each site can take over for another site. The problem with that, though, is that we need extra hardware.
Yep.
Right? We need compute, we need storage, we need networking, and all of that costs money. I'd say that's probably the biggest downside to this, wouldn't you?
And just going along with the money aspect, don't forget the people, right, that you're going to need on the other site in order to maintain it. And speaking of maintaining it, when you make a change in production, say you roll out a new application or something else, you have to make sure that you're taking into consideration the ongoing costs on your disaster recovery site as well. So,
yeah, what I have seen is I've seen people basically, as they refresh hardware in the production site, they move the slightly older hardware to the recovery site. And that's a perfectly valid way to do things. It's just you're right. You have to keep it up to date.
Yeah.
And it's a bit weird because it's like maintaining a car that you never get to drive. Right?
My car.
You know what it is? I have a better analogy. It's like me with the pool, right? That I have, right? I always wanted a pool. Now there's a pool in the back of my yard, in my backyard, and no one ever goes in it. All I have to do is I'm the one that has to clean it, right? I have to clean it and all of the things that comes with the pool. I get to do all that work for zero amount of joy. And so what tends to happen is the site tends to get behind things, and you don't really find out until you do a DR test. And so that's, but I think just in short, the reason why most people don't do this is the cost of doing it, right? That they have to buy all the hardware, you have to get it in advance.
Yep.
And all of that hardware has to be taken care of, and all of that stuff. Can you think of anything else that's like a downside of this method?
No, that's pretty much it. Yeah, I think it's just always sitting there, always like idle, basically, like you said. Now, there are things you could do to keep it sort of more functional. You could use it for, say, doing your backups. I know some vendors and some companies like to do their backups off of their DR copy just because otherwise those resources are just sitting idle. And so that is one possible use of your DR site. And I know we've talked about sort of what can you do with copies before. So go back, listen to one of those episodes.
Right. The one on copy data management. Yeah, absolutely. The next option that we have is this idea of just like everything else, we have recovery site as a service. And the idea here is that there is a place that will make sure that they have enough servers of a certain kind, enough storage of a certain capacity, and also capability, and of course all of the networking equipment that you would need. And so that the idea is, well, I'm just going to say I almost said something, but I'm going to. The historical idea here is you show up with your box of tapes, and then you do the recovery. So I'm going to throw that out there as one of the challenges with recovery site as a service. Why might that be a challenge?
Because because of the time it takes to rebuild stuff, right? Was that what you were looking?
Close. Well, so in the old days, I would show up with a box of tapes. How do I do that now?
Oh, you replicate the data.
Right, which means that I need to have, right. So in addition to providing me hardware and hardware and networking when I need it, they also have to provide me, I have to pay
to store,
to basically keep a copy of my replicated backups there, which will not be free.
Yep. Yeah. And I know that there are multiple companies who look at recovery as a service. Some of them pre-provision. I always worry about these companies. Like, what happens if like the New York area gets wiped out and everyone's trying to fail over to their DR site in New Jersey, and they under provisioned in that scenario, because they're not going to keep all that hardware around to guarantee no over provisioning, right? So
yeah, I'd say that the recovery site as a service model, that is its biggest Achilles heel, right? So the first is that, I mean, the good news is it's going to be less expensive than the first option, right? Because you're not paying for. I mean, you could. I'm sure that And by the way, like an example of the kind of service that we're talking about is like SunGuard, right? And that company's been around a really long time, and I think they've morphed actually over the years to also do the third method that we're going to talk about. But they have to make money. And so if they're going to maintain an identical, amount of infrastructure that is dedicated to you, that's the key, dedicated to you, then that's going to cost you a ton of money. It's essentially going to be more expensive than option one, because you have the cost of option one plus their margin.
Yep, exactly.
Okay? So they're going to do that. But what you're describing from before is, I think, the more common model, and that is that you have paid for the ability to have a certain amount of infrastructure available to you in a disaster, and the risk is that a bunch of you have a disaster. Right? And it's not the same as the cloud, where there is this seemingly infinite amount of infrastructure. You have an actual data center that is of a certain size that is meant to be, it was provisioned for a certain number of customers declaring a disaster at the same time. And then what happens when you have not a global disaster, but a regional disaster takes out everything? I think that's probably my biggest concern.
But
there.
I think, and I know we'll talk about it when we talk about the third option, but honestly, I don't think that's any different than like a public cloud. It's just the scale is different. But we'll talk about that when we get to the third one. The one other comment I wanted to make, and I don't know if you have experience with this or not, Curtis, is do they still allow you to have like the agility and flexibility of, say, my infrastructure is changing? How quickly can I push that out to my DR site? Or what's the process look like, and how much of a lag is there?
Yeah, I think that it's going to be the lag will be the same as what would happen if you did it, plus some amount of time.
Yeah.
Right. Again, it's going to be the cost of what you did it plus it's going to be the cost of what it would be for you plus their margin in terms of the lag time between production changes to changes in your recovery environment. It's going to be the same amount of time because it takes them the same amount of time to order servers as it does for you, plus some amount of time for them to sort of figure that all out. Right. And the only thing that may not be a problem here is that they probably over provision their environment, right?
I would hope so.
So they hopefully over provision their environment, because if you need to, there have been times in the last year or two where, a provisioning and an order of a new server is like 90 to 120 days, right? So hopefully they've ordered stuff in advance and they always have extra, capacity, which is something that they can afford to do that you might not. And that's where the savings comes in. Again, that savings comes at a risk of, a run on the bank. Have you, please tell me you have seen, because, I know it's always with you and me. I bring up a movie and you're like, I have never seen that. Have you seen It's a Wonderful Life?
Yes.
Okay. All right. You remember the run on the bank that happens at the end? Yeah, that's basically what you and I are worried about, right? Is everybody coming up and wanting the resources all at once because it's a disaster.
Do you know if when you go with the recovery as a service option, if all of the providers allow you to customize the hardware to what is there in production? So if I use a particular vendor, would they allow me to use that? Or is it sort of, here are your standard options, go forth?
I think both of those are available, right? This is business. Everything is negotiable, right? You use our standard options and it costs you this much. Start customizing it and it starts costing more, right? And so this is where the fact that most of us are running Wintel servers, right, really helps out. Most of us are doing virtualization. Most of us are using, Broadcom. I think that's the new name of the the company, right? And so as long as you're sticking with sort of the standard things from a hardware perspective, it's probably not a problem. But if you decide I've got to have vendor X, then your cost is going to go up because they're going to buy that hardware just for you. Again, plus margin, right? So I think this is like every one of these choices. None of these are perfect for everyone, right? Let's talk about the third option, and I'm sure everybody knows what the third option is, and that is recover in the public cloud. And the idea here is that they have so much infrastructure that you can very easily, on demand, with little planning. I mean, you need to do planning, but it's not the same as with the recovery site as a service. And that is you can at any time just literally press a button and you can do infrastructure as code, and poof, you've got as many virtualization servers or VMs or RDBMSs that you need, and that you don't really, within reason, you don't really have to do any planning ahead. You just have to make sure that your billing system works. Oh, you want to talk? Are you disagreeing with me?
I just want, because there is a lot of misconceptions about the public cloud. Just remember, it's someone else's servers. You're just borrowing them, right?
Yeah.
And so, if, say, an example is if you took AWS and they just didn't have the infrastructure to meet your DR needs in that region, then you may not be able to recover. So make sure that you have a conversation, especially if you're at that large of a scale, with your cloud provider to make sure that if you do need those resources, they're available because someone else may be using it.
Yeah. And I guess that's what I meant by, I don't remember my exact words, but you need to do planning. What I'm saying is you don't need to do planning like we're going to declare a disaster Friday, right? I mean, even then, it's not a bad thing to actually, if you're doing testing, I would do zero amount of notification to the cloud vendor. That's what I would do. And just to see how they respond. I guess you do need to do that type of planning. What I'm just saying is that
you don't need to pre-provision.
Yeah, you don't need to pre-provision that they should have enough infrastructure. And you can have those conversations. You say, listen, when we declare a disaster, we're going to need 50,000 VMs. Is that going to be a problem? And they're either going to go, 50,000? I thought you were going to say 1 million. Or they're going to say, yeah, you should probably give us a call.
Yeah.
Right? But I think the response is probably going to be more the latter, right? And the other beautiful thing about the cloud is that, and this is not true on either of the other two options, is the cost. Because in order for a cloud DR system to work, you need to have the data there already, right? And so you need to be backing up essentially to the cloud. But that's all you're paying for at that point. You're paying for the storage of the amount of storage that you need from that cloud vendor. Depending on how you're doing it, it could be block storage, it could be object storage. The object storage is going to be the less expensive option. The block storage is going to be the ready to use it anytime you want it option. But the point is that because with object storage, you're going to have to restore it to block storage, right? So it's not going to be as quick as a restore if you've essentially already restored your servers. But the beautiful thing is that you don't have to pay for the compute until the time of testing or declaring a disaster.
One other thing to add to that I think is a big advantage of the public cloud is I don't actually need the exact same resources compute-wise in the cloud for my testing as I do for production. So for testing, I might pick smaller instances, lower powered compute in order to do my testing because I don't need to spin up the beefy systems that I would need to actually run the production workloads.
Yeah, that is a beautiful thing because again, you can't really do that in the first two options. You just you get what you get, right? You don't throw a fit. But here you can say, look, I need an M4X large for production, but an M2 medium will do fine for my test. The performance isn't going to be great, but I'm not testing the performance. I'm testing the functionality of the recovery process. But I think honestly, the greatest advantage here is going to be cost. And I think that, and also that all of that infrastructure is available as code. What do I mean by that?
Basically, you don't need to go around configuring things. You could code it all up, have it all available, and basically push a button and say, okay, go build me my environment. Based on what you've already pre-configured, and it'll go do everything you need it to do. And you don't have to sit there and manually spin up things and provision, connect things with networks, go log into 20 different switches and environments in order to get everything up and running.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this at our previous employer, right? That you can automate that, and that you can, assuming you did enough, planning, and you configured everything correctly, you should just be able to literally press a button and then it configures everything that you need to do, just like you said. And then, just as magical, you can shut it all down,
Yep.
right? And as soon as you shut it all down, the billing stops,
Yep.
right? And that, basically you just pay for the amount of time that infrastructure was running.
Yep. Which hopefully means
which just isn't possible.
Yeah. And that also hopefully means you can do testing more often, because what do you like to say, Curtis?
Yeah. Test. Yeah. Now I'm going to argue with something that you said like 15 minutes ago.
Okay.
And that is, here's another thing that I like about the public cloud versus the recovery as a service. While it is true the public cloud is not unlimited, what I can do in the public cloud that I can't really do with a DR as a service is I can pick whatever region I want to recover to. If I'm a business in New York, I will most likely pick like we talked about SunGuard. I will pick a SunGuard that's in New Jersey, right? You're going to pick something that is close by because you're most likely physically going to the place to make this happen. With the cloud, you're never going to see that data center. And so it doesn't matter where you pick it. Well, let me rephrase that. It does matter where you pick it, but it doesn't have to be down the road, right? And so you're not going to have this. It significantly decreases the worry that there's a flood in the general vicinity where you live, and it takes out all the businesses, and then it also takes out the recovery site, and everybody's using the recovery site all at the same time. I'm just saying you can spread the load out.
But even the recovery as a service, you could technically go from New York to Texas, assuming that your recovery as a service provider is in Texas, replicate the data there. Yes, it is going to be more painful because you may not be on site, but
it is true. Yeah, that is true. I guess I'm just thinking that generally speaking, these types of recoveries were done
in person,
face to face. Yeah.
And
I have this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
In your mind, I know Veeam has a lot of DR partners that can take Veeam backups and spin them up and use them for DR purposes. Would you consider that as option 2, recovery as a service, or more in line with option 3, even though we're using the word public cloud there?
Yeah, I think, you're talking about like cloud IBR, like those guys. I think that is because you're using the public cloud as the underlying infrastructure, even if I think, don't they all use the public cloud?
They might have their own. They might have their own infra, but I think it's still more in line with the public cloud rather than the.
I think the way they behave, it behaves more like the public cloud. And I like this, right? Because it doesn't require you to use a different piece of software for DR. I like this idea of using one piece of software to do both backup and DR. It saves a ton of money for the company, as long as it meets your RTO and RPO requirements, right? And it backs up all of the applications that you need to back up. Then, it's a great way to do it. Can you think of anything else that we haven't covered?
No, I think that covers all the options. Well, there is a fourth option.
All right.
Which is,
dang it, I'm sorry, I'm looking in my book and I don't see a fourth option.
Which is basically you don't have a disaster recovery site and your host.
Oh, okay. You had me worried there for a minute. Yeah, that is the fourth option. No recovery site, no backup, no plan, no joy. Don't do that. So I think if you can learn anything from what we've been covering, is that plan, test, and also update your software and have a good password management system and have MFA, all of those things. And so now's the what's the thing of what's that old thing of like the best time to plan something is yesterday.
The next best time is
the second best time is today.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. There's something like that. Well, anyway, fun as always, Prasanna.
Likewise, Curtis.
All right. And I hope you listeners enjoyed that. We do it for you. And be sure to subscribe. We don't want you to miss any episodes. It's so much easier. It just pops up on your phone there. And you can listen to our cheerful voices. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.